You are just a small dot in the vastness of the cosmos, surrounded by ancient and technologically superior civilizations. The pride of the galactic powers was so immense that they almost laughed with disdain as they watched your species, humanity, attempting to find a place among them. Do they have what it takes? That was the question echoing in every alien mind when humans first set foot on the Galactic Council station. And what could they do when their technology looked like mere toys compared to weapons that defied physics? The aliens mocked, they laughed, and for a moment they believed Earth's fate was already sealed. But what these powers failed to realize was that humans, unlike any other species in the cosmos, possessed something that could not be replicated: the ability to fight, not just with strength but with intelligence and creativity. And while the aliens sneered at our bullets, what they didn't know was that we weren't aiming at their targets. Soon, with a simple move, the entire universe would have to reconsider humanity's place among the stars. Because in the end, it is far easier to underestimate others than to accept what is truly at stake. Do you want to know how a seemingly outdated weapon turned the tide and left the greatest intergalactic warriors speechless? Get ready for a story where humanity doesn't just defy expectations, it redefines the fate of the stars. Stay sharp, because now, those who consider themselves superior will have to swallow their words. When the human ship finally docked at the Galactic Council station, its vastness was overwhelming. Endless corridors lined with metallic panels and pulsating lights seemed to defy gravity, while floating platforms moved in perfect harmony with the rest of the station. To the humans, it felt like another world, something beyond anything they had ever imagined. There, in the presence of the most advanced civilizations, they were nothing more than a distant speck in space. But Lucan, the human commander, refused to be intimidated. He knew that despite the technological gap, humanity had something no other species possessed: an indomitable spirit. Lucan was accompanied by his team, Lyanna, the sharp-witted ambassador, and Cade, a diplomat with razor-sharp words. Together, they represented not just Earth's military strength, but its ability to negotiate with the galactic powers. They walked through the station with confidence, carrying the weight of a responsibility few could comprehend. The Galactic Council, composed of dozens of species that ruled the cosmos, watched them with skepticism. How could a civilization that had barely learned to travel among the stars possibly be a valuable ally? The gazes of the Sakuri, a race of cold, metallic beings, were like sharp blades slicing through human flesh, filled with disdain. When they were received by High Counselor Valen, the welcome was polite but devoid of warmth. His posture was rigid as he greeted them with a formal gesture. Yet it was Ambassador Neural of the Sakuri whose words dripped with venom, disguised as civility. "Humans," he said with an enigmatic smile, "always so eager. But do you truly possess the strength to stand among us?" The condescending tone was not subtle, and Lucan could tell that this was more than just a test of skill. It was a battle for acceptance in the council, and he had no intention of losing. But the real challenge was yet to come. The council station, a symbol of intergalactic superiority, was not merely a place for diplomatic negotiations. It harbored secrets, like an ancient clock hiding the tension within its gears. Every corridor pulsed with a nervous energy, as if something was on the verge of exploding. The human team was aware of this, but chose to remain vigilant, showing no signs of uncertainty. It wasn't just the council watching Earth. Within the station, spies from various galactic powers moved in the shadows, ready to act if humanity proved to be a threat. As Lucan and his team awaited the next steps, they could feel the eyes of countless species upon them. The Unari, a race renowned for their mastery of high-tech weaponry, observed them with disdain, as if they already knew Earth's fate before any action had been taken. But humans, with their unique ability to improvise, were far from defeated. They knew that no matter how distant the stars seemed, the real gap lay in the minds of those who refused to see beyond their own superiority. A gap that, once bridged, could change the course of the universe forever. Tensions continued to rise as the grand shooting tournament approached, with the most powerful civilizations preparing their advanced weaponry. The Adarians, with their rifles capable of distorting space and piercing impenetrable barriers, were the favorites. Alongside them, the Furunari, armed with fragmentable ammunition, were ready to showcase the effectiveness of their weaponry. And of course the Sakuri, whose technological precision seemed to defy the very laws of physics, were a formidable adversary. But Lucan and his team weren't there just to display their combat skills. They were there to prove that the human spirit was something no technology could replicate. The grand shooting tournament would be the first step toward humanity's future in the cosmos. But what no one knew was that, among the stars and within the very station itself, something far darker was about to unfold. The Galactic Council, with all its pomp and ceremony, was about to be tested by something even the most powerful galactic forces could not foresee. Humanity was about to show the universe that, despite being one of the youngest civilizations, it could also be the Yao, most dangerous of all. The fate of Earth was about to be written in the stars, and the Council's station would be the stage for a battle that would change everything. And Lucan knew this was only the beginning. Tension filled the air. Lucan and his team were ready, but before they could make a move, a subtle vibration rippled through the environment. Something was about to happen. Something that could threaten not only their safety, but the future of the entire galaxy. Little did they know, they were about to be pulled into a conspiracy that could forever alter the course of history. With a glance at his comrades, Lucan said, "Stay sharp. This tournament might be the last simple thing we see here." And with those words, the grand event began. The grand shooting tournament kicked off with a deafening roar, the sound of thousands of spectators from various galaxies settling into their floating stands, their voices echoing through the enormous glass walls of the arena. The first competing species wasted no time impressing the audience with their incredible technological weaponry. The Adarians, wielding rifles that manipulated space itself, fired projectiles that effortlessly phased through solid barriers, leaving spectators in awe. Meanwhile, the Furunari captivated the crowd with their fragmentable ammunition. Tiny capsules that split mid-air upon being fired, creating a deadly rain of fragments that struck multiple targets simultaneously. A display of precision and control that had the audience clamoring for more. Then, it was Earth's turn. Lucan, his expression unreadable, stepped forward with a Barrett M82, a high-impact long-range rifle. The weapon seemed antiquated compared to the energy-based rifles of the other competitors, and murmurs of mockery rippled through the arena. "Bullets? That's prehistoric," scoffed a Unari officer, eyeing the weapon with a condescending smirk. No one expected humanity, a newcomer to the galactic stage, to bring a mere kinetic rifle to a competition of such magnitude. The very idea that Earth would represent its military might with seemingly outdated technology left many in sheer disbelief. With unwavering composure, Lucan adjusted his rifle, fine-tuning the sight system for what he knew was the opportunity of a lifetime. But the moment he fired, the crowd erupted in laughter. His shots, far from hitting the visible targets, veered off in seemingly random directions, making it appear as if the veteran commander barely knew how to use his own weapon. Lucan's eyes remained locked on the arena, but his mind was already 5 steps ahead. This wasn't a simple mistake. It was a meticulously planned strategy, a masterstroke that only a select few would understand at that moment. While the spectators laughed at the spectacle, Lucan stayed focused. He knew exactly what he was doing. His missed shots weren't errors, but deliberate deviations, precise adjustments in a plan that only he and his team understood. To the onlookers, humanity had just humiliated itself in front of a galactic audience. But in reality, Lucan was setting the first piece of a much greater scheme into motion. By dismissing the power of human weaponry, the galactic superpowers were making the biggest mistake of all, underestimating humanity's ability to adapt, reinvent itself, and understand the art of combat in ways no machine or advanced weapon ever could. Meanwhile, the Sakuri, with their absolute precision weaponry, watched with cold, calculating eyes. Unlike the others, they didn't find amusement in the spectacle. To them, Lucan's failure might just be the final proof they needed. Proof that humanity was not worthy of an intergalactic alliance. Your own plans were being orchestrated in the shadows, and the tournament seemed to be nothing more than a distraction, a way to discredit the human race before any possibility of an alliance could even be considered. Ambassador Neural, with his restrained smile, was already envisioning the next step of his strategy, ensuring that the humans were defeated before they could establish themselves as a threat. The reaction from the other participants was swift. The Unari, for instance, had begun mocking the inefficacy of human weaponry. "Do these humans really think their bullets will hit anything other than their own feet?" One of the Unari officers sneered, speaking with the confidence of someone well-versed in advanced combat tactics. But amidst the mockery, something was forming in Lucan's mind. He knew that to surprise the universe, he would have to use more than brute force. He needed to rely on what made humanity unique, the ability to think outside the box. Human strategy had always been based on improvisation. While the galactic powers, with their superior technology, believed victory was assured, Lucan saw things differently. He knew the secret lay in the details, in reading movements, in understanding the opponent's psyche. And even when it seemed like humanity had no chance of winning, the real battle was only just beginning. As the competitors continued their shots, Lucan's true purpose began to unfold. Yet among all the taunts and laughter, one question lingered. In his mind, what if the others weren't aiming at the target? What if the real target was something much greater than a mere shooting competition? What he didn't know was that he wasn't the only one asking that question, and what he would discover next could change the course of the entire galaxy. The grand shooting tournament was far from the simple spectacle everyone had imagined. Soon the real war would begin, and the cards were about to be turned. Lucan knew something was wrong. The tremor in his hands, the cold sweat trickling down his forehead, all of it signaled that the battle he had envisioned wasn't so simple. As the competitors pressed forward, his senses, sharpened by years of combat and warfare tactics, picked up on small anomalies. These weren't miscalculations or human errors. Something else was happening, lurking in the shadows of the arena. He couldn't prove it, but he could feel it in his spine. It was as if he was being watched in a different way, as if the competition had been rigged before it even started. Then he saw it. During the third round, one of his bullets veered off in a peculiar way. Instead of hitting the impact point, the bullet passed through a space where there should have been nothing, an apparently empty area. He froze. Something was interfering with his shots, but he didn't know what. Quickly, he adjusted the rifle's systems, recalibrating the sensors, and that's when he realized it. Camouflage drones were on the field, manipulating the results of the competition. They were interfering with the trajectories of the projectiles. His shots hadn't missed. They had been redirected. A wave of dread washed over him. The Sakuri were sabotaging the competition, making the humans appear incompetent. Without hesitation, Lucan reacted. He knew that now, the competition was no longer about combat skills or merely impressing the council. Something far more sinister was at play. What had seemed like a simple showcase of skill had transformed into a deadly game of manipulation. The Sakuri, with their cold and calculated tactics, were attempting to bring humanity down before it even had a chance to prove its worth. The conspiracy was obvious now. The drones were being used to craft a narrative of failure for Earth. And at the heart of it, the Sakuri weren't just trying to discredit the humans, they were trying to eliminate a council leader. High Counselor Valen himself was the target, and Lucan couldn't let that happen. With flawless precision, Lucan recalibrated his rifle once more and fired a shot across the arena. But this time, he didn't miss. Instead of hitting a random target, the bullet destroyed one of the camouflaged drones. The impact caused a silent explosion, but in an instant, the holographic screens around the arena flickered. The drones were exposed. The grand deception had been revealed. A wave of panic spread across the station. Competitors scrambled in desperation, and the council, President watched in horror as chaos unfolded. The Sakuri, with their facade of superiority, were now unmasked as traitors. and the coup against the council that they had been trying to orchestrate was in plain sight for everyone. The tension in the arena reached a new peak. Lucan, now aware that the tournament was merely a facade for a darker scheme, advanced with his team, each member fulfilling their role. Lyanna, with her diplomatic cunning, immediately contacted Cade, her diplomatic ally, to alert the other galactic powers about the betrayal. Meanwhile, Lucan's gaze remained fixed on the arena, where the Sakuri were trying to organize their now exposed troops to erase any traces of their coup. He knew that by exposing the camouflaged drones, he had taken the first step in thwarting the plan, but it was far from enough. The council was at risk, and the Sakuri would not give up easily. The Unari, armed with their fragmentable weapons, were now uncertain. Many of the other competitors began to question their own alliances, and some even considered supporting humanity in light of what was unfolding. The tournament had turned into a real battlefield, and all eyes were on Earth. For Lucan, this meant one thing: the fight for his people's survival had truly begun. It was no longer a sporting competition. It was a deadly battle for humanity's survival in a hostile universe, where conspiracies and betrayals could destroy anyone, including the Galactic Council. Meanwhile, at the back of the arena, Ambassador Neural struggled to maintain his composure. His eyes were locked on the screen, watching the chaos unfold. Lucan had unmasked him, but that did not mean the Sakuri would surrender easily. They had more plans, more resources, and more allies than anyone could imagine. From that moment on, the humans needed more than just skill to win. They needed something beyond strength. They needed intelligence and courage, qualities that, unlike the Sakuri, humanity possessed in abundance. The battle was far from won. But now Lucan knew that humanity's future did not depend solely on what happened in the arena. The real fight was beginning, and Earth's fate would be decided not just by the weapons they carried, but by the strategic intelligence and resilience they were willing to offer. The revelation that the Sakuri were behind the sabotage of the Yen competition not only changed the course of the tournament, but also triggered a chain reaction that placed humanity at the center of a struggle for survival. When the camouflaged drones were exposed, the station's authorities, initially stunned, began to mobilize. But what they did not yet realize was that the true threat did not come from the Sakuri's advanced weaponry, but from something far more dangerous: human strategic ingenuity. Lucan and his team were far from being just another defeated army in an intergalactic competition. They had exposed a conspiracy, and now they were preparing to fight for their survival. The Sakuri, seeing their plans crumble before their eyes, wasted no time in acting. A signal was given, and the shadows around the arena turned into a battlefield. Sakuri troops emerged from the station's hidden passages, their metallic bodies gleaming under the red platform lights. They were a formidable force, wielding technology far superior to anything the humans possessed. But Lucan was not just a commander, he was a master of psychological warfare. He knew that more than advanced weapons, what mattered at that moment was the ability to divide the enemy's forces, to create confusion and uncertainty. With Lyanna leading communications and Cade keeping diplomatic channels open, Lucan took command of the battlefield. The human team, once seen as inferior, now fought with an unusual fervor. Using the same strategy that had impressed the council during the competition, Lucan began to direct his shots. The smart bullets of the Barrett M82, which had been underestimated, until then began curving through the air, striking the Sakuri with lethal precision. Humanity's ability to predict trajectories and adapt quickly to unexpected situations made their weapons a threat that no machine, no matter how advanced, could replicate. Lyanna and Cade, each in their own way, also played crucial roles. Lyanna, with her sharp mind and guerrilla tactics, began forcing the Sakuri to split up. She knew that if she could disperse the enemy's forces, victory would be within reach. Cade, in turn, was not just a diplomat. He was a natural strategist. He used his negotiation skills to forge unexpected alliances with some of the galactic powers that had initially been skeptical of humans. The Unari, who had once mocked Earth's technology, began to see the value in an alliance with humanity. They realized that what humans had in abundance was not just technology but also ingenuity, a quality that the oldest civilizations had lost over the millennia. As the battle unfolded, Lucan felt the tension rising. He knew that no matter how skilled he was, his strength was limited. The council station was a fortress, and the Sakuri were only one of several threats. He also knew he had to act quickly. The council was at risk, and if he couldn't defeat the Sakuri now, Earth would lose its chance to join the intergalactic alliance. But with every shot he fired, confidence in human abilities grew. The idea that humans were a weak, vulnerable race was beginning to fade. It was not technology that defined them, but their courage and ability to adapt in extreme situations. However, things were far from easy. The fight was fierce, with the Sakuri using all their advanced weaponry to try to regain control of the station. Combat drones and cloaking devices kept emerging, but human resistance did not waver. Lucan felt a surge of energy in his veins as he surveyed the battlefield. He knew that even with their numerical disadvantage, humanity possessed something other races could not comprehend. The combination of military strength and strategic intelligence was beginning to turn the tide. The reactions of the other competitors reflected shock and surprise. Those who had once ridiculed humans were now reconsidering their stance. Some began fighting alongside Lucan, not out of loyalty but out of necessity. The Galactic Council was in danger, and without human intervention, the Alliance could collapse. The battle for Earth's survival was no longer just a fight for acceptance. It was a struggle to preserve what remained of the galactic order. The Sakuri, powerful as they were now playing on unfamiliar ground. Humanity, with its immense resilience and adaptability, was breaking through enemy lines one by one. And as the fight progressed, Lucan knew that, in some way, the real war was only beginning. What he didn't know was that this conflict could determine the fate of the entire galaxy, and that the next move would be the key to humanity's ultimate victory. The battle for survival was reaching a critical point. Lucan knew the Sakuri would not give up easily. They were a race of relentless warriors, equipped with cutting-edge technology and led by cold, calculating leadership. But what the Sakuri hadn't anticipated was the unstoppable force of human determination. Lucan and his team had managed to turn the tide, but the fight was not yet won. The Sakuri, with their ambassador Neural at the front, began retreating, attempting to organize a strategic withdrawal. But as they fell back, Lucan realized that the final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. In a desperate move, Ambassador Neural tried to activate his cloaking device, but Lucan was ready. With a precise and deadly shot, he destroyed Neural's cloaking equipment, leaving the Sakuri exposed. The Sakuri leader, now fully revealed in his fury, tried to escape the arena, but it was too late. Lucan, with the accuracy that had made him a legend among his troops, fired once more. The perfect shot struck Neural in the heart, deactivating his cloaking technology and crippling the Sakuri forces beyond repair. With Neural's fall, the Sakuri resistance began to crumble. Their soldiers, deprived of leadership and weakened by the loss of their central figure, started to scatter. One by one, the Sakuri warriors were taken down by the humans' precise fire, who were now proving their ability to react swiftly to any situation. Lyanna, with her cunning, continued using guerrilla tactics, forcing the Sakuri to split up and lose cohesion. Cade, with his diplomatic skill, ensured that other galactic powers did not interfere in the battle, allowing humanity to make its decisive move. As the battle raged on, High Counselor Valen watched from his position of leadership, a mix of astonishment and recognition in his eyes. He knew that what was happening was not just a military victory. It was a reflection of human nature, unpredictable, resilient, full of surprises. The galactic powers were beginning to understand that humanity was not just a weak, primitive race, but a force to be reckoned with. The humans' victory over the Sakuri was not merely a military conquest. It was a triumph of intelligence and courage. As the last of the Sakuri fell, the tide of battle finally settled. Humanity had prevailed, but the victory was not just over. The Sakuri, It meant something much greater. The Galactic Council, which had once viewed Earth as an inferior civilization, was now being forced to reconsider its stance. High Chancellor Vallin, witnessing the outcome of the battle, could no longer ignore the reality before him. Humans had exceeded all expectations, and more importantly, they had shown the universe that they were a force to be respected. But a great challenge still lay ahead. With the fall of the Sakuri and humanity's victory, the Galactic Council called for an emergency meeting. The victory on the battlefield now needed to be followed by a political maneuver. Vallin, who had initially regarded Earth as a contemptible species, began to realize that the galaxy's fate might be tied to humanity's future. It was time for a decision. Accept Earth as a full member of the Galactic Council, or risk losing the chance to integrate humans into an intergalactic alliance that could change the course of history. High Chancellor Vallin called for an emergency vote. With the galactic powers watching closely, the future of humanity was at stake. When the vote was finally concluded, to the surprise of many, Earth was accepted into the Galactic Council. Not for its military strength, but for the intelligence, courage, and loyalty demonstrated during the battle. Humanity's victory was not just over the Sakuri forces, but over the very nature of the universe itself. Humans had proven that when united, they could reach for the stars. With victory secured, Lucan turned to Lyanna and Cade. A faint smile formed on his lips, but he knew this was only the beginning. "We survived the first round," he said, "but now the real politics begin." He looked up at the stars, and for the first time, he knew that Earth's destiny was no longer in his hands. The cosmos, with all its complexities, was now looking at humanity with new eyes. As humans not only survived, but reshaped the perception of the galactic powers, the question remains: what comes next? What will happen when the universe, with all its ancient and powerful civilizations, has to deal with a new ally that doesn't fit the mold, but possesses something none of these cultures can replicate? The real politics begin now, and the next stories promise to take us even further. Will humanity secure its place among the stars, or will the galactic powers try to prevent its rise? What do you think will happen in the next chapter of this epic journey? Don't miss the next video to see how humans will continue defying the universe's expectations. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to make sure you don't miss a second of this intergalactic adventure. What will be humanity's next step in the cosmos? Only time will tell. Or rather, only by watching will you find out.